In today's video, we're going to cover a wood called Torrefied Maple. Now, this is not a separate species of maple. It's a process done to maple, specifically hard maple in this case, that changes the characteristics and the color, and which makes it a slightly different kind of wood to work with. Now, to cover it quickly, torrefication or heat modification is simply putting hard maple, in this case, into a chamber where you remove all of the air and then you heat the wood to essentially the burning point. This destroys all the organic material inside the wood, lignins, I believe, and removes all the water. It essentially dries it out entirely. Now, I can't verify that. I don't have the scientific equipment to test, but that is the claim, that it becomes almost essentially completely dry and free of water. Because there is no air in the chamber, it can't burn, which is why you're left with this incredible color and these special characteristics of this wood. So what are the benefits? Well, the main one, stability-wise, is it doesn't expand a whole lot because there is no humidity that's able to go in and out. It can't expand across the width anywhere near as much as normal wood does, so it's very stable in that case. You obviously get this beautiful color change. Remember, this was a piece of hard maple, so very light. This is a piece of bird's eye. Just keep that in mind, how light this is compared to what it is now. This is why specifically I chose this. I'm going to make a box. I wanted this beautiful color. I think it looks amazing, but that's going to be up to you. After that, there's also claims that it's more rot resistant. It does not absorb water very much. When you put a drop of water on it, it doesn't really want to go in very much. So I think that's where the claim comes from, that it just won't absorb water, but I wouldn't advise using this as some kind of outdoor wood. I don't know of any scientific papers that have shown that it's totally rot resistant to a level as normal outdoor woods are. And the final benefit, and this is just a personal one of mine, it smells like slightly burnt caramel when you're working with it. Very sweet, just like a slightly burnt caramel. It's delicious smelling. So what are the downsides? First, it's much more brittle than normal hard maple. It gets more tear out. It has a tendency to kind of cripple out once some tear out starts, and it can be totally devastating to a project. So you have to be very careful. Sharp tools, do everything you normally would to prevent tear out, but make sure you don't skip any steps, because this can it can take a chunk out really easily. And the other main downside is, because it's so dry, if you want to use an oil finish, which I've done, it just keeps taking it and taking it and taking it, which of course means there's more in there to dry and to cure. And I think it looks amazing with an oil finish, but just be prepared for it to keep soaking it in. You're not going to be able to just slather some on and walk away. It's going to be very dry very quickly. So the next thing is that torrefication process has to be done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, it can be very warped, cracking. It can cause a lot of problems. So make sure you're buying it from a source you trust, to make sure that the torrefication, the heat modification, has been done correctly. You should be able to see all the way through the identical color on the end grain. There should not be any sight of anything other than this dark brown color. Now, in terms of hardness, and I've only seen this done in hard maple, though I've heard on some forums that people do it in curly maple or soft maple as well. So you could be looking at anywhere from 900 to 1600 on the Janka scale. So quite hard. That's up there with the white oaks, but not like a desert ironwood. Price-wise, from what I've seen, $12 to $18 a board foot, depending upon how much figure is in there. You can get it curly, bird's eye. I've only seen a little bit of what I'd consider plain. It seems mostly that people who are going to do this process to sell pick out really nice boards, bird's eye and curly, and then do it to it. So you're paying a premium on top of hard maple. Obviously, the process, the time it takes, the materials it takes to do the process add on some cost. But in my opinion, for certain projects, I think it's really cool and I think it's worth it. Now, normally in my scale, I go from 1, which I consider poplar, to 10, which is something like a desert ironwood. But we're not really talking about the same characteristics in just terms of hardness. We've got other things going on here. So 1 is still going to be poplar. I still like that comparison because of how few problems it has. But everything upwards from that is not specifically related directly to another type of wood, but just levels of difficulty and or frustration up from the very easy to work with poplar. I hope that makes sense. It's just, this is a unique wood, or a unique process that's done to wood that changes characteristics. So the scale is going to be slightly changed, as it's not really comparable to a really dense hardwood that I normally use in my scale. We're going to begin with the milling process, and on this I give it about a 6. You have the same problems of curl and bird's eye with tear out if your blades aren't sharp, so you have to expect that. And then tear out can get drug along and cause a huge chip out if you do get a chunk of tear out. This was planed 12 hours ago with pretty sharp blades, so which is why you don't see any problems here. But I've had it in the past, and boy, when it goes wrong, it goes wrong. So be very careful if you're going to machine this jointer, planer, all of that. It hand planes fine. It's like hard maple. It's hard, it's dense. But machine planing, be very careful, because if you do get some tear out and it goes wrong, it will take a whole chunk with it. Next up, we have the table saw. For rip cuts, this is about a 6. It's a hardwood, hard maple level of Janka hardness, so you're going to get the normal requirements of a decent sized motor, a sharp blade, a little bit of burning if you're not getting your feed rate right, but no real problems ripping. On the cross cutting though, this is definitely going to be a 7.5, maybe even an 8, because of that same tear out and brittleness. If you're not taking all the precautions, it will take an entire corner off with it. I'm turning this into a mitered box. I've done it once before, specifically with this type of wood in terms of mitered boxes, and I was able to make it through. It worked out okay, but I have had times in the past where doing other things, where even just a normal cross cut, not even a mitered, it takes out a whole chunk with it. So be very careful. Use a high tooth blade, a cross cutting specific blade, zero clearance, things like that. On the bandsaw, this stuff is a nightmare. It's an 8 for sure. I was cutting something out for a couple projects ago, lots of curves, lots of shapes, and the only way I could get it to not have serious tear out everywhere was to cover the entire back in blue tape and then to use a brand new zero clearance insert tabletop on my bandsaw. I've got a video on reducing bandsaw tear out, and doing all of that was the only thing that allowed me to not get really bad tear out along the whole cut. It's very annoying because you obviously have to waste a bunch of blue tape. You got to pick the blue tape out of the blade later on because it gets clogged up. But very tear out prone on the bandsaw. And again, you have the same problems of hardness, like a hard maple in general. So your blade needs to be pretty sharp, making tight turns. If you have a higher tooth blade, definitely use that. I was using a 6 tooth, which is normally fine in almost any hardwood and doesn't really have a ton of tear out, but on this type of wood, it was a serious problem. Chiseling is going to get a 6, just normal hard maple problems. In terms of density, no real issue there. Perfectly fine on the edge and the face. The end grain is obviously difficult on harder woods, but I wouldn't say there's anything uniquely difficult about the torrefied maple versus the hard maple. So just a 6 in general for how difficult it is to chisel on hard maple. On the router, this is getting a 7 because of tear out as well. I did some mortises with a router bit, and you have to use, well, I shouldn't say have to, you really should use, I would highly recommend using a downcut spiral bit to avoid tear out on the top. I made the mistake of starting with an upcut spiral bit, and I had some nasty little tear out that I had to deal with some planing. It ended up okay in the end, but be very careful with mortise routing. And then on edge profiles, I was using a round over bit that wasn't the newest and definitely had some brittle breaking away there too. I was able to get a new bit, which solved the problem, but be very careful with routing as well. Use the right bit and make sure it's clean, sharp, new. Ideally, if you're going to pay for this wood, you're going to pay that extra premium, you want to get the look, you should really take all the precautions to make sure your project turns out as nice as possible. In terms of sanding, this is a 6. Same problems as with hard maple. It takes longer to sand away hard woods. Make sure you go up the grits at the correct level. Don't try to skip too much. You're going to be spending a lot of time sanding. Just sand as you normally would a hard maple and you'll be fine. It can be worked to a really nice polish. It can get incredibly shiny and it's absolutely beautiful. For Glueups, this is going to get a 3, mainly because when I was doing miters on the previous one, pre-gluing is something I do where I mix glue with water, put it on the mitered edge to try to block out some of the soaking in of the normal strength glue, and boy did it soak up a lot. So otherwise, if you're not doing any kind of miter thing, it's a 1. Glues just like a normal hard maple and just as easy as any other wood. But on that specifically, because of how dry it was, there were a lot of problems in terms of how much it soaked up. And then just in terms of finishing, we have the same problem we talked about earlier, where if you're using some kind of liquid finish, it will soak up a ton. It sprayed fine with some lacquer that I used on it once. I didn't try polyurethane. Haven't tried any hard wax oils or anything like that. But with linseed oil, boy, did it soak up a lot. So just be prepared for that. It means a longer dry time. It means you're going to have to pay a little more attention as you're putting it on initially. You may need to do more coats than you normally would with another wood that doesn't soak up as much. Get a little closer look here. There's some mineral spirits. You can see how dark it gets. It gets very dark, but it leaves an incredible look. If you want this color that it looks normally, it's not going to look like that unless you use something like a lacquer or water-based polyurethane to maintain that color. It gets incredibly dark. But like I said, boy, does it look nice. And that's going to do it. I would not recommend this wood for a beginner. At least work with something like normal hard maple first. Get an idea of how working with just a wood that hard wood works. If you've done like white oak, you're in that range of Janka hardness anyways. But the problems with tear out and the brittle nature, it can be really problematic. So be prepared for that if you are going to choose to work with it. If you're going to spend that extra money, I think it's beautiful. I think it has some great places where it's an excellent wood to use. But with the price and with the difficulty working with it, I wouldn't say it's great for every project. Hopefully that helped you decide or at least gain some information on whether torrefied maple is something you want to work with. Have a good one, and thanks for watching.